door open.
How was it before the...
Very warm.
Yeah, okay, so but it was closed. So,
Yeah.
Depends how noisy they are in the building. Yeah, I think we have to go. Hvernig er hæðin?
Já, jú.
Slökkt í honum. All right. I hope you had some refreshment and some fresh air. And so now we have a few sort of legal presentations. Here's Auður, my colleague, legal officer, who will explain to you how EU law becomes EEA law. And then we will have people coming from the EFTA Surveillance Authority and the EFTA Court, which are two fundamental institutions serving the EEA agreement. But first, please, Auður, you take the show.
Hello, good morning. My name is Auður Steinasdóttir, and I'm a legal officer in the Internal Market Division here at the Secretariat. And now I want to basically go through the procedures for incorporating EU law into the EEA agreement with you, now that you've been introduced to all the basics of the EEA agreement and how it functions. Before I start, I want to once again draw your attention to this picture. As has been mentioned before, this is the front page of our web tool on how EU law becomes EEA law, which was launched earlier this year. Here you can actually see, on the right side, you can see part of the web tool. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go through the web tool with you. I would very much like to, but I strongly encourage you to have a look yourselves. But I just want to point out a few features about the tool. For example, as you can see on the far right side, it is actually available not only in English, but also it has been translated into the 3 EFTA languages, German, Norwegian, and Icelandic. And the web tool basically, it has 3 layers, so you can always kind of seek more information if you're interested. And again, I strongly encourage you to take a look. But first, before I go into more details, I want to start with showing you the very short version of the incorporation procedures, as illustrated in a video that we made, which is, you could say a teaser for the web tool. So, Þorfinnur, do you have it?
Yeah. Sorry. All right, let's... Is er niet doen? Is er niet doen?
The European Economic Area, the EEA, brings together the European Union and Iceland, Liechtenstein and Norway in the internal market. The EEA agreement is dynamic and continuously updated to ensure common rules for the free movement of goods, capital, services and people across the EEA. How does EU law take effect in the 3 EFTA states, Iceland, Liechtenstein and Norway? Experts from the 3 EFTA states contribute to shaping EU legislation before it is adopted by the EU. For instance, they participate in meetings of EU expert groups and committees. They also submit common positions to the EU institutions. When the EU adopts an act, the 3 EFTA states assess its relevance for the EEA, and then request the EFTA Secretariat to draft a decision to incorporate it into the agreement. In this decision, the EU Act may need to be adjusted to fit the EEA agreement, for example, to ensure EFTA participation in an EU agency. Other adjustments reflect specific situations of the three EFTA states, such as geography or infrastructure. Each of the three EFTA states has its own national procedure to prepare for incorporation and implementation of an EU Act. When the three EFTA states have agreed on the content of the decision, it is sent to the EU External Action Service, the EEAS. The EEAS and EFTA Secretariat coordinate the discussions between the EU and the three EFTA states on the final text of the decision. Once the draft decision is ready, it is sent to the EEA Joint Committee for adoption. This committee meets around 8 times per year and is composed of the ambassadors of the three EFTA states and officials from the EEAS. It takes the formal decision to incorporate the EU Act into the agreement. Joint committee decisions normally enter into force 1 day after adoption. If a decision requires amendments to national law, the parliaments of the three EFTA states must approve it before it can enter into force. EU law that has become EEA law must be made part of the national law of Iceland, Liechtenstein and Norway. The EEA, extending the EU internal market to Iceland, Liechtenstein and Norway. If you want to know more about how EU law becomes EEA law, please visit our website.
So yeah, the link to the web tool is available here, and it's also available on the EFTA Secretariat's website. So now I will take you through the longer version of the process from the point where the EU drafts new legislation until an act has been incorporated into the EEA agreement and the three EFTA states must implement it. So here is the first stage. This is maybe not strictly part of the incorporation process as such, but nonetheless it's a very important stage, and Britta's actually already covered quite a lot of it as concerns decision shaping and the EEA EFTA comments. But what I want to mention is this early assessment by experts of EEA challenges in proposals. So when the EU publishes an EEA relevant proposal, the EFTA Secretariat registers it and the relevant policy officer sends it to the experts in the...
There's some sound. Sorry about that. YouTube.
Ah, okay. Sorry about that. Here we go. Yeah, the relevant policy officer here at the EFTA Secretariat sends it to the experts in the EFTA working and expert groups in the EFTA states, asking them to assess any possible EEA challenges. This is actually a very useful tool because it allows us to already start working on finding a solution to any possible issues. And it really helps speed up the incorporation procedure later on, once the act is adopted. So this is you could say, the formal starting point of the incorporation procedures. That is when the EU publishes it in the official journal to the EU. And you might have seen that EU acts are often marked as being EEA relevant, which is the assessment made by the EU side, by the Commission. You can see it here. This is normally, of course, a very good indication for us, but it does not, however, have any automatic implications, and it is technically not legally binding for the EFTA states. Sometimes it can be simply maybe wrongly labeled, and sometimes EEA relevant acts are maybe not even marked as EEA relevant. So the EFTA Secretariat and the EFTA states always have to make an individual screening or an assessment of all new acts that are published in the official journal. So we have our own register here at the Secretariat who monitors all the relevant registers daily and the official journal. And she actually launches the process by identifying and registering EEA relevant acts, and then sends the task off to the relevant policy officer in the Secretariat, who makes a preliminary assessment of the act and then sends it to the experts in the member state for under a certain procedure. And we have two main procedures, and the choice of procedure for processing acts, it mainly has to do with deadlines. It's a question of either a shorter deadline of 6 weeks of tacit approval or 16 weeks. So here you have, this is one of the two main processes, so-called fast-track procedure. Then the member states actually get a 6-week tacit approval deadline, basically meaning that if they don't oppose, then it has been approved after the 6 weeks. And this basically applies to all straightforward acts that don't have any implications, no adaptations needed, no constitutional requirements, etc. And if one of the member states opposes to a fast-track procedure, which can happen, then the standard procedure kicks in. Excuse me? Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. So here you have the standard procedure, which is the second main procedure that we have. There, our member states are given 16 weeks to return the standard procedure form. They have to fill out, give us all sorts of information, if there are any possible issues, any adaptations needed, do they have constitutional requirements, and so on. So now the Secretariat has done its preliminary assessment and chosen the relevant procedure, and now it is sent over to the experts in our 3 member states. And this is, as was mentioned before, where most of the work happens, with the experts in the line ministries, in the working and expert groups. So now it's up to the experts to scrutinize the acts. Firstly, it needs always to be checked, is it EEA relevant? Usually this is quite clear. It's basically the question, does it fall within the scope of the EEA agreement or not? But there can, of course, always be some exceptions where it's not so clear, and then that needs to be discussed, of course, with the EU side as well. And then there's the question, are there any needs to have adaptations? And I want to just, this is a little bit complicated, so I hope it's not too much information, but I just wanted to tell you a bit about kind of the different forms and types of adaptations that we have. So basically you could say there are 3 different forms of adaptations, but all adaptations, they have the same effect, basically that the acts need to be read in a specific way for the purpose of the EEA. So basically we have, firstly, very important, we have Protocol 1 to the EEA agreement that applies to all acts incorporated into the annexes to the EEA agreement. This is a horizontal adaptation, basically setting out how all incorporated EU acts shall apply, and this is done in order to avoid recurring general adaptations to every act that is incorporated into the EEA agreement. For example, it ensures that all rights and obligations for EU member states also apply to the EFTA states and their citizens. It controls the entry into force as regards the EFTA states, references to territories, languages, just to basically widen the scope to cover the whole of the EEA. And then secondly, you have a so-called sectoral adaptation, covering a specific annex to the EEA agreement, or part of an annex. And this is, maybe the next kind of step to having a horizontal adaptation. Then, for example, we have an Annex 1 to the agreement, which covers veterinary matters. And there is a sectoral adaptation there in the beginning of Annex 1, stating that a specific chapter of that annex shall not apply to Liechtenstein. Then there is no need to So every time we incorporate an act into that annex, we don't have to ask for an adaptation each and every time that we incorporate. We just simply, you can refer to the adaptation, to sectoral adaptation in the annex. And then what I will discuss a bit further now is the so-called specific adaptations. So basically it's in cases where Protocol 1 on horizontal adaptations or sectoral adaptations do not apply, we might need some specific adaptations. So there are basically two types of specific adaptations. The first one, so-called technical adaptation, and this is the most common type of adaptation that we have. It basically has no material effect on the act, does not have any material changes. It basically just extends the act to the EEA EFTA states, and as an example, it could be adding the EFTA states to a list of countries in the act, including the EFTA languages maybe, also references to the TFEU, the Treaty on the Function of the European Union. Where we have that, we always have to refer to the corresponding article of the EEA agreement, because of course the TFEU does not apply to us directly. And then we have the so-called substantive adaptations. They basically entail a deviation from or adjustment to the system that is laid down in the act that is adapted. And examples of this, so-called institutional issues, it's typical for these two-pillar issues on the two-pillar structure that has already been mentioned. When the EU has delegated powers to its agencies, EU agencies, to, for example, adopt binding decisions toward maybe market participants or even issue fines. This is, of course, not covered by Protocol 1 to the EEA agreement. So it must be ensured that the two-pillar structure of the EEA agreement is followed. And this is, for example, has been done as regards the financial supervisory authorities, as has already been mentioned. We also have complete exemptions to acts due to maybe specific situations of the EEA EFTA states, such as maybe geography. Iceland is an island that can cause maybe some issues, climate, infrastructure, and so on. And as I said, it's important to note that adaptations to acts that are incorporated, they are not very common. We're talking about maybe 10 to 15% of all acts that are incorporated into the EEA agreement. Most of the acts are incorporated without any issues or any need for any adaptations. And my colleagues will actually later on today discuss in a bit more detail the two-pillar structure and give examples on adaptations, etc. Here I only want to mention this. I will not go into it in detail, even though I would like to. It would simply take too long. I just want to point out that, of course, at each and every stage of the incorporation procedure, you have procedures in the 3 EEA EFTA states as well. And it's actually quite interesting to see how much they differ. They are quite different between Norway, Liechtenstein, and Iceland. And I really encourage you to have a look at the web tool. There you can actually see what is happening in each of the 3 EFTA states at each time in the process. So now we have received feedback from our experts in the EFTA states. And now we're ready basically to draft a decision to incorporate the act. It's normally the EFTA Secretariat that drafts the joint committee decisions on request by the EFTA states. And basically once the EEA EFTA states have approved the draft decision, the Secretariat forwards it to the European External Action Service, the EAS, which has the role of coordinating the EU's part of the EEA process. So the EAS launches a so-called inter-service consultation on the Act with the relevant DGs, or Directorates General of the Commission. And it also needs to be checked always with the Commission's legal service. Normally this consultation takes approximately 10 working days, and if there are no adaptations, the EEAS can adopt the act on behalf of the EU in the Joint Committee, and the review process stops at this stage. And this is, as I said, for the majority of acts, this is what happens. And so usually in total the process takes maybe around 3 weeks on the EU side here. However, if we have substantive adaptations, then actually this takes quite a lot more time. Then actually the JCD must go through the Council. And this process takes approximately 3 to 6 months, but it really depends on each case. It can take much longer even if there are also need to be discussions between the two sides on specific issues, etc. And I should also mention that if the EU requests any changes to the draft JCD, we have comments on something they don't think works, etc., then we have discussions basically between the EU and EFTA sides, with the aim, of course, always to find a common solution. And these discussions are then coordinated by the EFTA Secretariat for the EFTA states and the EEAS for the EU side. So now both sides, both the EFTA and EU, have finalized their approval procedures. The act is ready to be adopted by the EEA Joint Committee. The Secretariat actually coordinates a list of acts that are ready to be incorporated. Following certain complicated procedures that I won't go into, an agreement is reached between the EU and the EFTA states on which acts are ready to be adopted at the upcoming EEA Joint Committee meeting. So all decisions are taken in by the EEA Joint Committee, as has been mentioned. It is responsible for managing the EEA agreement. It meets approximately 6 to 8 times per year and consists of representatives from the European Commission, our colleagues from the EEAS, the 3 EFTA states at ambassador level, and observers from the EFTA Surveillance Authority. So following adoption in the Joint Committee, decisions normally enter into force the day following the meeting. However, there are some very important exceptions to this, and the most important exception is when any of the 3 EEA EFTA states notifies that they have so-called constitutional requirements. And this happens when the decision incorporates an act that calls for amendments to national legislation in any of the EEA EFTA states. Then the relevant national parliament needs to actually approve it before it can enter into force. And this can actually take, normally it shouldn't take more than 6 months, but can take a bit longer. So just to make this a bit practical, this is actually what a typical Joint Committee decision looks like. Perhaps, difficult to see. So first, basically, it sets out the legal basis, and then the act that is to be incorporated is listed, and also in which annex, so basically in exactly which point of the EEA agreement it is to be incorporated. And then this one here has a so-called technical adaptation. So basically meaning when this regulation is applied in the EEA, it always has to be read with that adaptation in mind. So here is basically adding the 3 EEA EFTA states to a list of member states. So now you could say that the incorporation process is finished. Once the Joint Committee decisions have entered into force, the annexes or protocols to the EEA agreement are updated accordingly, and the incorporated acts must now be made part of the national legal order of the 3 EEA EFTA states. And it's for the EFTA Surveillance Authority to monitor compliance with the legislation incorporated, And then the EFTA court has jurisdiction to decide in cases regarding the EEA agreement. But Birgir and Kat from the EFTA court and the EFTA Surveillance Authority will tell you everything about that a bit later on. And finally, I just want to already mention the EEA web tool quite a few times. I also want to draw your attention to this really useful tool here that we have on the EFTA Secretariat's website, EEA Lex. Basically, it's a very useful tool for finding information on the status of EEA relevant acts that are in the process of being incorporated or have been incorporated. It sets out basically where it is in the incorporation process, in which annex you can find it, and then here actually below, you can't quite see it, but there's actually also a link to the act itself and to the joint committee decision that incorporates the act. So I really recommend that you have a look at that. And again, strongly encourage you to take a look at our web tool where you can really dig further into the incorporation procedures. And yeah, thank you very much.
If there are immediate questions specifically to either, because then we go to the institutions. So, yeah.
Hello, my name is Marina Yunel. I work at the Commission at the Translation Department. And one of my tasks is actually to translate the decisions of the Joint EEA Committee into Swedish. It's quite technically difficult because one of the problems is, since you mentioned several times, the EEA agreement is evolving all the time. I am actually not quite sure where to find the latest version because I think it doesn't exist in a consolidated version in Swedish, of course.
Mm-hmm. So basically you can find it on our website. The EEA Lex, the tool that I already mentioned, that's a very useful tool. There you can always find the most, once they have been adopted, of course, and entered into force. There you can always find the joint committee decisions, but you can also actually access them directly on our website. There's a list kind of categorized by each year.
Yes, my question was regarding the EEA agreement itself, actually.
Sorry. That is always you can always find the most recent version, updated version of the EEA agreement and its annexes and protocols on our website. So.
Thank you.
Over there, yeah.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I'm Guillaume from Andorra, from the government of Andorra. You said that there are two procedures, the fast-track procedure and the standard procedure. I would like to know, and I'm sorry if you already mentioned it, on what grounds you decide whether it is one or the other procedure. And I have two more questions. There are two reviews, one by the EFTA Secretariat and the other by each member state. What is the difference in these analyses? I mean, why do you repeat this procedure twice? And concerning all these steps that you presented, I would like to know if because the EAS is involved in some of these steps, I would like to know if there is some sort of administrative convention or agreement with the EES to foresee all these steps. Thank you.
Thank you. So first about the choice of procedures, that's actually a very good question. Basically fast-track procedure applies to all acts that are straightforward, that don't cause any issues for us, and we don't need any adaptations in order to be able to incorporate them. We actually have a standing committee decision, basically listing kind of the fields where we can process under this fast-track procedure. But also the EFTA Secretariat can always suggest this procedure to the member states if it thinks basically there are no issues with that act. And the member states, of course, always have the last word. They can always oppose. There's actually a box for it, even in the form, to oppose. And then basically what happens is that it just goes back and the standard procedure is initiated, basically meaning that the member states have longer time to assess the relevant act. Secondly, as regards to the two reviews, it's maybe, so basically what the Secretariat, we are a Secretariat, so we are assisting our member states in their work, basically. So when I'm referring to our kind of processes of reviewing acts, it's basically to assist the EFTA states, to kind of prepare them for their incorporation processes. So when the experts in the EFTA states receive a form from us, they already have set out basically what is our opinion, what is our officers. We have specialists for every field, and these policy officers basically make a first assessment of the act and set out if they think there might be any issues, possible issues. That is already set out, and then it's of course always for the EFTA member states, for the experts there to make the final assessment. Finally, as regards the cooperation with the EAS, no, there is no such kind of agreement or anything, but we have, as has been mentioned earlier this morning, we have an excellent cooperation with them. It's been working very well, so yeah, there's no need, I think, for such an agreement. But we actually have, as regards maybe the council procedures, when an act has substantive adaptations and needs to go to council, then there is actually a regulation that has been set out on the EU site. It's from '94. I think it's in the slides actually. It's a sort of reference there in a link, which basically sets out the procedures on the EU site, what happens there when it needs to go through council. So hopefully that answers your questions.
Okay. Okay. One last question before we continue.
I am Joseph from Andorra also. Thank you for your presentation, and my question is related to the transitional time to apply a new legal act. Could you have to negotiate some kind of exceptions for applying a new legal act, or not? That is the question, just to see how the application, because one thing is to enter into force and the other one is the date that we will apply this new legal act and implement in the reality. So I don't know if you will have this possibility and to negotiate some kind of exception if needed.
Yep, thank you. That's a very good question, actually. So basically, in Protocol 1 to the agreement on horizontal adaptations, it's set out there as regards entry into force of the act that for the EEA EFTA states, it can only enter into force when the joint committee decision incorporating it enters into force. So that's one thing. And then you have the other thing, which is the question of transitional provisions. So if the act has any transitional provisions, then yes, we always look into whether there's a need to adapt that for as regards the EEA EFTA states, and it is often done. It's of course always up to the EFTA states to assess whether there is really a need, because often we are of course incorporating, the act enters into force for the EEA a bit later than it does for the EU states. But it can be really important sometimes for the EFTA states to maybe, if there's, for example, given 6-month transitional period to apply something or etc., then there could be a strong need to have that. And it has been done, on several occasions. We have gotten, so if it's 6 months for the EU states, we ask for 6 months after the entry into force of the joint committee decision, for example. There we have quite a few examples like that.
Okay. So, best thanks to Auður. Maybe just to show you where this famous web tool is found. Actually, here in the center pillar here, you have everything that's related to the EEA and our relationships to the EU. And there's a pop-down menu here with a lot of stuff, and one of them is called How the EEA Works, where you find the video and the web tool in different languages. And so this is how it looks, and it has a lot of pop-up information that will, when you get more information on different topics. So it's really a very user-friendly and interesting tool to use. Really encourage you to do that. So next up, we have Catherine Howell, once again from the EFTA Surveillance Authority. Welcome. Actually, we're going to move in together. I mean, EFTA Secretariat and, and the Surveillance Authority. Maybe not yet, me and you, but the building next door that is being built will be the premises for the EFTA Secretariat, the EFTA Surveillance Authority, and the EEA and Norway grants. So it will be like a triple number of employees in next door building next year in the autumn. So that's something to look forward to. So, Kath, you please.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much. Can everybody hear me? Okay, good. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Kath Howdle. I'm the Deputy Director in the Legal and Executive Affairs Department at ESSA, at the EFTA Surveillance Authority. And this morning I'm going to talk to you about surveillance, how the EEA law is enforced. So you heard from Özür just in the last session her details on how law, which is EU law, becomes EEA law. That's the first part of the story. And then the next part of the story is once it's become EEA law, what happens then? What mechanisms do we have in place in the EEA EFTA pillar in order to ensure that the member states remain in compliance with that EEA law? So once a directive is part of the EEA annexes to the EEA agreement, how do we make sure that the member states are doing what the directive asks them to do, for example? And the answer to that is, well, lies with the EFTA Surveillance Authority and with the courts. So there's a surveillance and court mechanism which has been created in the EFTA pillar to ensure compliance. So European Economic Area, we all know it's 31 states at the moment, and it's one single market. We have the 4 freedoms, there's a lot of horizontal legislation, there's regulations and directives, lots of secondary legislation, even some tertiary legislation. So a whole great big body of legislation which ensures a kind of stable playing field, a nice even playing field for people to do business and move and live their lives across Europe. So this is a little bit more detail about how we make sure that level playing field, which is always a good thing, remains something which actually works, and how the legislative framework helps to make that happen. So what is ESSA's core role? So EFTA Surveillance Authority monitors compliance with the EEA agreements in Norway, in Iceland, and in Liechtenstein. The basis for this duty is set out in Article 108 of the EEA agreement and in the Surveillance and Court Agreement. If you are a legal geek like me, or if you are not a legal geek but have chronic insomnia, definitely go and have a look at the Surveillance and Court Agreement. It is very detailed and sets out really everything that the Surveillance Authority and the court ought to be doing. And you'll hear from the court in a minute. So this lecture, I guess, is to give you a little bit of insight about what ESSA is, who we are, what we do, how we do the various things that we're charged with doing in order to make sure that the member states on the EEA EFTA side remain in compliance with their obligations under the agreement. Okay, so first, who are we? Well, basically, ESSA is when I'm giving a presentation to people in the EEA pillar, I kind of think maybe they know already a little bit about ESSA. But when I'm giving a presentation to people who don't know anything about the EEA pillar, what I start with it by saying is that the EFTA Surveillance Authority is extremely small. As an organisation, we are very, very small. We're about 75 to 85 staff, and that's it. and we cover a whole load of different areas of compliance. I mean, this makes it very exciting to work at ESSA because everybody has to be very much hands-on. You get to deal with very high-level cases very quickly. You have to be kind of a